Hello, everybody, and welcome to our December 6th edition of the Scientific Governance and Risk meeting with Steven Becker. I believe this is our 15th episode, which is amazing, if you ask me. That's a lot of great content. If you're interested in catching up on some of that great content, we have all of our previous meetings have been uploaded to YouTube, to our YouTube channel, which we can post a link in the chat to in a second. And we also have audio-only versions, which are super handy for the old commute and daily walk, which I highly suggest. There isn't a lot lost in the audio version, and it's a lot easier to digest sometimes. So check it out. It's on SoundCloud, and I think David is about to post a link to that if he hasn't already. Steven, I'm going to hand it off to you immediately because we rarely have enough time to get through everything we need to in these meetings. So I'm not going to have a huge preamble. So if you want to take it away for us.
Sure. Thank you, Richard. So the first thing I'd like to do is just recap a couple of items that we covered in the last meeting. What we did was we looked at the issues with governance. We spoke through the necessity of a quorum and how MakerDAO does not need one because it actually incentivizes constant vigilance. We spoke about apathy. The ability to also inform and engage MKR token holders, and to what extent there was a comment previously that a certain amount of apathy tells you that something might be working, as people are more confident in the fact that it's working in the background. They don't want to be included. A very interesting point of view, but at the same time, given the fact how we've constructed the voting mechanism, I would hope to try and pull folks from apathy into the voting construct. And then we also discussed vote purchasing and, by implication, delegation as well. There wasn't anything concluded from that point other than the fact that we discussed it, and we tried to get to some sort of conclusion as to how it is catered for in our construct. And I think the scientific rigor that goes into the actual proposals helps us manage that to a certain degree. The next item I want to talk about, which was something I brought up in the previous meeting, but we didn't get around to it, was that after a bit of survey from the community, we found out that calling the two votes a governance vote and an executive vote was a little bit confusing. And because the governance vote, to use the correct parlance, is more about signaling. In my old tired days, it was just more about resolution and what you resolved. But I think I like the idea of signaling a lot better. So if this is going to be a signaling process, then it was decided, and obviously this is up to you guys to chime in, to instead of calling it a governance vote, to call it a governance poll. And then we have the process being information, conversation, governance poll, executive vote, which then implements the underlying code. And what I'd like to emphasize as well is that the executive vote is, again, not thought in the context of executives in ivory towers sitting on large chairs. It's executive in terms of it being an executed policy, an executed code. So that's the point of that particular naming strategy. So that's the recap. So anybody wants to say about the recap before we carry on, before we move over to the new topic? And I'm going to leave it at that. Good. So what I'd like to focus on today are risk teams. There's a lot to be said about risk teams, but essentially the first thing I would like to look at is who can be a risk team and who should be a risk team. Now, I have mentioned before that pretty much anybody can be a risk team.
Sorry, Steven, I don't want to wreck your flow, but maybe would it be useful to just discuss or maybe do a brief recap of what a risk team is supposed to do, or is that something you're going to get to later?
Yeah, that's exactly what I'm going to get to.
Okay.
So basically, who can be a risk team and who should be a risk team is pretty much informed by what the risk team is supposed to do.
Okay.
And also is informed by the characteristics of a really good risk team. So I think maybe we can start from there. Have a look at the characteristics of a really good risk team. The first and most important characteristic is longevity. You have to realize that you're in this for a long time. It's kind of like a proof of stake mechanism, where the longer you have been involved, the more meaningful your contribution is going to be. I think that's going to be the pivotal point. How people then decide what the game theory is around that would obviously extend, but essentially what you want is someone who's going to stick around and who's going to contribute consistently. Folks are allowed to obviously adapt and grow. So whatever their process is, we should expect it to expand and improve. But essentially their presence and their contributions should be consistent and should be clear and very concise. So that brings me to the next characteristic, and that is transparency. Now, in one of the earlier community calls that we had, we spoke about risk teams being completely transparent versus being sort of slightly transparent. And what do I mean by that? There are some folks who would like to obviously give you exposure to the full construct of their risk mechanism, and then show you the output from it. And there are some folks who just wish to share the output, but keep the mechanism to themselves. That is a possibility, but unfortunately, when it comes to the ability to aggregate their contribution, which is a topic which I'll touch on shortly, it will be weighted obviously a lot lower. So we got to take these things into consideration. But essentially what we need is longevity and transparency. Those are the two major components or major features of a risk team. And what a risk team ultimately is required to do is contribute their assessment of collateral to the MakerDAO system. And now, why do I talk about assessment as a whole, as opposed to risk parameters, which are clearly the contributing numbers that go into the system? It's because I'm alluding to the fact that the risk process is a very broad process. It starts from data acquisition to data cleaning, all the way through to verification, validation, and then the use of it in terms of qualitative assessment of a particular token and its organization, all the way through to a quantitative assessment of that data to give us the risk parameters that we need for the system. Now, that's quite a sequence of events. So you can imagine a risk team is not defined by covering all those bases. A risk team could be just a point in that sequence, or a risk team could actually be someone that purposefully contributes and submits to the MakerDAO system. Now, to that end, who can be a risk team? Well, I would say anybody could be a risk team, but the caveats there are you need to be a stakeholder. So in the very least, you most probably need to have a little bit of MKR, because that MKR gives you the ability to put proposals forward. So that is the primary requirement to be in a risk team. Other than that, the transparency and the longevity are necessary, but there are extensions. The extensions mean that you need to obviously be capitalized, you need to be well structured, you need to be purposeful. You can't just decide one day you're going to open up a spreadsheet and just contribute, because one needs to remember that in order to do that, you need to be able to sustain yourself. This thing is going to take time. It's going to take effort. You need to be incentivized and rewarded appropriately. Another topic which I'm going to touch on shortly. Okay, to that end, I'm going to stop there with just the statement of any stakeholder could be a risk team. So any questions from folks on the call?
Well, I have a list of 7 questions, but I'm hoping to get more from the community. So just as a reminder, anybody in the call, feel free to jump in at any time in the chat or on voice and ask away, because we're open. Akiva, you have a question. Did you want to type in chat, or do you want to get on the mic and ask?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep.
Indeed.
So is there an issue of independence in risk teams? Because because let's say someone has a lot of CDPs, they might not want them to be a risk team because they might be biased in assessment of their CDPs. Or maybe if you have some sort of financial or professional services firm which has clients which are opening up CDPs, they might be biased as well because they might try to underrepresent how much risk is they might try to represent in a biased way how much risk there is because they want to get their clients the lowest possible interest rate.
Well, in a very strange way, those kind of biases are welcomed because it's another point of view, if you just think about it in that context. And what we need from a decentralized risk function is as many point of views as possible. Some of them are going to, well, actually, few of them are going to be unbiased because just the notion of what is unbiased is tentative at best, but everyone is going to come in with a certain amount of bias towards something. And you need the collection of those biases to construct and aggregate a proper decentralized risk function. So yes, I'm aware of the fact that CDP holders may want to be risk teams and contribute with clear bias, but their proposal has to be based on something that is clearly scientifically vetted and reproducible. That is a very important item. That goes part and parcel with transparency. I didn't want to touch on it specifically, but reproducible research is the most important thing. I'll give you an example. If we include a new collateral type, and obviously someone has skin in the game on that collateral type, they're going to wish to benefit by its inclusion, and also benefit by a large debt ceiling and a low stability fee. So I would suppose that they would, put this proposal forward, but they need to do it not just in terms of numbers, because numbers don't really mean anything at the end of the day. It's how they went about doing it. That's got to be vetted. That's got to be proven. That's got to be shown to be clear, concise, and rational. And if that methodology is included, then it's really a case of just putting the correct data in. And if that data is something that everyone has access to, everyone can vet, everyone knows the source of it, then you're very clear as to the data going in, the mechanism used, and the output that is going to be applied. So if there's going to be any bias, it's going to come through changing the process that was previously approved. And if someone is trying to influence the change in the process, they will be found out. And if they're found out, they'll be obviously discarded from the mechanism. So it behooves them to make sure that whatever process is vetted and proved and included in the system remains as such. And if they do have biases, they unfortunately can only voice them through lobbying on social media or lobbying through published articles, but they won't, well, strictly speaking, they shouldn't be able to do it through the actual mechanism of generating parameters. So to a certain degree, I'm not going to say everything is foolproof, but to a certain degree, that has been considered and has been guarded against.
Does that answer your question, Akiva? Cool. Well, I had a list of questions, and I was looking over them, and it occurs to me that many of these might be implementation, and I might be asking for detail that doesn't exist yet, but I'm going to throw them at you anyways to see what you have to say. So you said longevity is one of the key aspects of a risk team. So does that mean that a risk team needs to be around for a while before they can contribute to the system, or does that mean that the weighting increases over time?
The weighting increases over time. Okay. It's almost like a reputational value that gets included into the weighting. There's two aspects to it that still haven't been fleshed out, but we need to put it into action in order to realize how to flesh it out. And that is understanding when a model is as successful as it thinks it is. Mm-hmm. And that is obviously very important. So there's a lot of back testing. So you got in sample, out of sample, in sample and out of sample testing that you would need, and that would be part and parcel of a record of performance that a risk team would put forward, and they would put this forward and mention how they have performed against it. And we may derive a metric on the basis of that, which would adjust the weighting appropriately. But for purposes, the longevity is truly the most important.
Okay, so I think that I have some other questions too, and I think that they all kind of can be bundled up. So transparency, Would obviously, the more transparent the organization is, I'm assuming that would raise their weighting as well, or lower it. Is that correct?
Yes, the transparency doesn't necessarily have to be on the organization specifically, but on the process.
On the process.
On the process. It's got to be very clear. I would imagine that there would be some portal on a website where you would go in and actually have a look at a tutorial around the process, have a look at actually maybe even the code itself, have a look at a step-by-step process, and then have the ability to put in your own data and see what the outcome is. Try to basically break it, see where it doesn't work and where it does work. And within that context, get a very good understanding of what this process is. And fundamental to that, the thinking behind that process, because that's really what we're challenging here.
Yeah. So we have longevity, transparency, minimum level of interaction you mentioned as well. And all of these things, they roll up into a weighting system. And so I guess that the logical question now is, how is that weighting system applied to a specific risk team? So when a proposal is put forward, do we have like a little percentage sign next to it, or 4 stars or 3 stars? Or?
Well, here's the interesting thing. Firstly, we have to just talk about the sort of ecosystem around this distributed risk team function. You're going to have what effectively are supporting entities and submitting entities. You might find someone who is particularly good at gathering data, cleaning data, and validating it. And as a consequence, they wouldn't be able to submit anything, but they would help another organization who would do the necessary quantitative analysis. So they are a risk team which we need to approve for the MakerDAO system, but they will not be submitting anything. To that end, it really boils down to who actually is doing the submission. So that collection, that supply chain, if you will ultimately be taken into consideration when looking at a weighting of that particular submission. So there's a couple of constructs that you've got to keep in mind with respect to what is it that you're weighting, because there's a sense of a risk team mapping to their own contribution, whereby that may not necessarily be correct. You may actually have a couple of risk teams working together to submit figures. And because they're working together in a more specialized sense with a division of labor which allows them to do a much better job, you might find that their submission carries more weighting. How we're going to go about with that weighting, I'm not entirely sure, but that's something we have to bootstrap as well as we go along. This ecosystem is very much like the MakerDAO system as a whole. You needed to have a flywheel approach, find how much traction you've got, where's the adoption, and then follow through with the structure once an amorphous amount of momentum actually takes place. So I think from that perspective, keep in mind that the distributed risk team or the risk function will have supporting and submitting entities. And then just keep in your mind how those permutations would work in terms of who would submit, and you can think from there what sort of features you would look for in terms of weighting on that submission.
Okay, there's a lot to process there. A lot of these, as you start digging into the complexity, I think the natural next question that a lot of people have, and I can see that the question is showing up in the chat already, is around incentivization. Is that something you wanted to talk about later in the call? Or
yeah, that's the third point that I'd like to bring up as well.
All right, well,
but, I'm looking at the chat now. Are there any questions that we should cover right now?
Possibly. Nick, did you want to ask your question about independence?
Yeah, well, so this is kind of a more general question, and you might get to this a little bit later, but are you imagining these risk teams are going to be separate from the foundation and kind of independently managed, run, led, essentially coordinated via social media or whatever, but not through formal channels?
Well, that's the hope, is that this distributed risk team function is actually made up of a collection of completely independent organizations and entities. That is the foundation of it working. You need to have independent points of view so that you capture not only all the biases, but you can actually extract the value from the different opinions that come into the fray. That is essential. The independence is essential. right now, the foundation risk team is just merely a template. What we're putting in place is simply a construct that's showing the end-to-end process and saying, folks, this is the process. This is what we need to cover. If you wish, please go ahead and start your own. And you are more than welcome to come and take what we have. It's open source and improve upon it, or just take it as an idea and just create your own. The one thing that I'm not going to attest to is the fact that the construct that we're going to make is the perfect construct. It's going to be a framework that is clear in its construct, in terms of it being modular, so you can quite easily come in and take the bits and pieces that you would like and put them together to make what you would require. And then the most natural question after that is, why would you want to become a risk team? And this leads to incentives, which I'll touch on shortly.
I have a quick follow-up. So are those resources already available now? Because I've kind of been toying with this idea of starting some sort of nonprofit foundation along these lines already in my head, and I'm pretty plugged into the community, but I don't think I'm aware of these resources right now.
No, those resources have not been made available. The two articles that have been published and the slew of governance calls really has started getting the wheels turning. So the question, you're about the third or fourth person I've got the question from, so it looks like there's some traction here. The third article that's going to come out is going to cover governance and the idea behind it and what we're trying to achieve with it. And shortly after that will be the first, let's call it a technical document. It's not strictly technical in an academic sense. It's pretty much just a construction around how the risk parameter is going to be calculated, and I'll be sharing that soon. I'm just trying to figure out the way to demonstrate this. Do I demonstrate this on a workbook? Do I create some sort of new quick website that shows how it works? It really boils down to the explanation of the granular steps that you wish to take. I find that if you're in a workbook situation, you can go right down to obviously the cell and the numbers. If you create a nice website, you've abstracted a lot of it out. So I'm trying to figure out, at least for this first part, what should be done, and I'm open to suggestions.
Great, thank you.
That's an interesting question. Thanks, Nick. I think that, and Steven, his final point is a really great one to make. So Nick, if you have any ideas about how we could do this, maybe drop us an email or jump into chat and we can get the conversation started there as well.
Okay, will do. Thanks.
So I think the next question, David, do you want to ask about diversity and balancing the data?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, this was coming out of a discussion in the chat that we're having about independent risk teams. And actually, Akiva brought up a really great point that he foresees that there might be professional CDP custody and management firms who might represent like a cohort of CDP holders and conduct independent risk assessments as another vertical of like income. If, like, for example, Maker decides to allocate some resources to funding risk teams. Like that might be interesting, or it might just make sense for them to do independent risk assessment themselves if they're just Maker holders. But yeah, I mean, if Maker holders feel that the amount of risk teams is not diverse enough to really like secure the data, or like if DAI is growing larger, the risk of failure is larger. So you might want to allocate like a part of stability fees to risk teams. But yeah, I don't know. I'm just kind of thinking through that.
As per one of the previous community calls that we've had, we stripped down what a stability fee is.
Right.
And in the stability fee, there's a component which is attributable to the operating cost of MakerDAO. And within that component, you need to look after obviously all your service providers. And the most important service provider will be a risk team. And no matter what form of function you take, you should be compensated through that stability fee. So it's also now a question of how distributed is your risk function in relation to the amount of DAI that's actually being generated, because it will become a very clear calculation in terms of how much a risk team should be getting.
So, Steven, can I follow up that with a question of, so when when Maker token holders decided to raise the fee from 0.5% to 2.5% because of like the larger supply demand of DAI imbalance, how do you factor in like the overhead portion of the stability fee into the larger decision-making framework around like using the stability fee to defend the integrity of the peg? Like, do you see a problem with that overlap, or do you see like there being, yeah, like is like the right conceptual way of thinking about it? Does it have to be that the CDP is comprised of like these basic, like this basic essential, like minimum threshold of fees that have to be paid no matter what? They can't go lower than that, and then anything above that is really to control the peg or to like what are your thoughts on the overlap between those
Well,
two
you pretty
things?
much answered the question. Now, in the stability fee, you've got, as I mentioned before, you've got a couple of components. You've got the sort of credit components, you've got the operational components, and then you've got this policy-making component as well. And that policy-making component is very much a function of the dislocation of supply and demand that's in the market at the moment. And the response to that will be obviously the adjustment to that policy component. But essentially, if you stripped out everything, it boils down to the fact that there is a basic cost component that will always be there. In effect, any interest rate that you see that is offered to you will always have the cost component. Everything above it is an adjustment for certain risks. And what we've done is not terribly different. When I say what we've done is how we presented a stability fee is not terribly different in the way that you construct a normal interest rate. And then the policy component you will use to obviously help with any dislocations you find in the market.
Thanks. That pretty much answers it. All right.
All right, I think if there's no more questions, we can probably move on with the doc, Steven, and then we can dig into incentivization when we get there.
Okay. So just where we left off, so the one thing I wanted to emphasize was this ecosystem that develops around the risk team function, or the distributed risk team function. It's not too dissimilar to anything else. I mean, think about this. There's going to be an ecosystem around keepers. There'll be an ecosystem around CDP users. The one aspect everyone can relate to very easily is the ecosystem around DAI users, because effectively it's just the economy. But what you've got to keep in mind is that all stakeholders will start generating their own systems that integrate together into this broader economy. And the distributed risk team function is just one of them. You're going to find that the breadth and depth of application and function is going to start becoming specialized. You may find that there will be risk teams that contribute on the basis that they are derivative specialists. You may find that there are risk teams that come in on the notion of being finance specialists. So there's going to be this whole integrated framework that is going to pretty much encapsulate the MakerDAO system. And what we're doing is we're sort of pausing the whole thing for a second and looking at a small component of it called the distributed risk team function. But keep in mind that this thing will be connected to all the other ecosystems that's been created for each of the stakeholders in the system. The final topic that I want to basically bring up with respect to risk teams is how do we apply the collection of risk contributions to the system? In other words, what is the objective? As you know, the objective is the stability and integrity of the MakerDAO system. Now that sounds really nice, but how do we put that down into the nuts and bolts? And that boils down to how do we understand what collateral should be included and how do we build this collateral portfolio? So number one, how do we actually include the collateral types? Well, you need to get, this is back to the risk teams, you need to basically get the right risk teams in place and appropriately incentivized to achieve those objectives. And to that end, how are they incentivized? Simply speaking, they're paid. They have to be paid. If they're not paid, they're not incentivized. And it really boils down to, where does that attribution of incentive come from? And as I alluded to, and as David brought up in the previous question, it should come from the stability fee. So there's going to be a net flow of funds into the system, of which certain part of those funds will go towards service provision of the system. You think about the decentralized risk team as a good example of a service provider, but keep in mind, what about accountants, auditors? What do we do with respect to that? Do we need them? To what extent do we need them? If everybody is proficient enough to be able to query the blockchain itself, you'd be able to do it yourself. But for those that interact with the system, they don't have the proficiency. How does one find out the general state of the system? What's the balance sheet snapshot of the system? Someone will have to do that. Will it necessarily be a risk team? It could be, but their function could be integrated with an auditing function. Very much like I told you previously, you could have one with the financing function or a derivative structuring function. So there are many combinations with that, but essentially the incentive will come from the stability fee, or the net funds derived from the stability fee. How those incentives are paid out will then obviously be conditioned on the weighting your contribution will have to the system. Does that open up to a whole bunch of potential gaming? Well, potentially. And this is where we obviously need to sit down as a community and say, well, how do we get the benefit of stability to the mechanism without going through, which effectively is like what you have on the governance side being a plutocratic issue, you'll probably have on the risk side being a kind of a power issue, where you might find a collection of folks get together to do one submission. And because they've got such a division of labor and so much specialty, it behooves you to give them a greater weighting. And if they get a greater weighting, they get greater amount of incentive. That the economics around that obviously still need to be fleshed out in the flywheel bootstrap adoption transition. There's no ways I could sit back. I could construct one now, but then what I've done is I've constrained.
Did we lose him?
I think so.
All right. I'll ping him in chat.
Great structure that we need.
Sorry, Steven, we lost you for 10 seconds there, I think. But
okay.
I guess this is where I'm always tempted to kind of push you into a corner and say, like, let's get some details and some numbers here, and feel free to fend me off. But so if we're going to directly incentivize risk teams, as in we're just simply going to straight up pay them, I'm trying to figure out what the order of operations look like here, because somebody comes to us and they say, oh, well, we're a risk team and we want to do a proposal about XYZ token. That's going to is the next step that they say this is going to cost X dollars, and then we pay them those X dollars, or the community pays them, and then we see whether that worked out or not, or how does it? Make a guess, I guess, at what the mechanism would look like.
Okay, I think the submission will be basically on the mechanism will be based on a time frame more than a submission. So I'll give you an example. Let's say we get 20 collateral types, right? And they all need to be approved right now. Do the folks that submit for those 20 collateral types, should they get paid more than someone who has been around for 3 years and only has submitted for 4 or 5? So there's that balance there between literally work done and longevity as well. And to what extent do they get paid? Is it a payments on a per contribution or per submission basis, or is it just really a case of saying, well, you are a service provider, you have a rate, and this is the rate that is being paid. And dependent on a couple of inputs to this function, one being longevity, the other one being transparency, that rate will obviously go up or down.
That's interesting. So there's kind of a weighting thing here. Is there any kind of a feedback mechanism where we can say that, like, in the past you've been wrong 4 times in a row, and so
that goes towards the weighting. If you recall from my previous statement, I said that we'll devise some metric to say how well your model has performed, and that will come back into the weighting mechanism, and that weighting mechanism will obviously be used for incentivization as well.
Sure, reputation, I guess, is the key to this thing. So we're not contemplating sort of a skin in the game model. You mentioned earlier that the risk teams are expected to have a certain amount of maker or a certain interest, I guess.
Well, in order to put forward a proposal, you obviously need to be a part of the community. I mean, that is essential. And then, to the extent of putting skin in the game, that is a very plausible construct.
I guess in your model, it's the reputation is the skin, right? Like, if they're wrong.
In essence, being wrong is worse than losing a certain amount that you've staked, because you lose a certain amount of stake by being wrong. It might be a case of, whoops, sorry, I'll try again next time. But you still have the same weighting, the same incentive structure. But if you get it wrong, it's whoops, sorry, and your weighting goes down. There may be some construct where there's an intersection of the two that may be required, but from the outset, as I said, trying to put any rules in place right now may constrain the effort more than anything else, because as soon as you put rules down, people try and figure out what's the optimal trajectory to take. Sorry, the optimal trajectory to take. And I don't want the optimal trajectory. I want just any effort, any trajectory. Because once you do that, you're going to make it a lot clearer as to what is required, when it's required, and how it's required. So, we're trying to flywheel this new thing. And in doing so, I'm sort of loath to put any rules in place.
Okay, yeah, there's a lot to process. So I guess the future discussions will be about just implementation then, like how to attract the risk teams, how to incentivize them, what the parameters look like.
Because right now it'll be a case of, well, how does this work? As Nick mentioned previously, I want to do this, how does it work? And once you've got that construct in place, then it's a question of, okay, I've got it working, everything is in place, how do I get approved? Right, I've got myself approved, now how do I get paid? Or it might be a case of, how do I get approved and paid? Or how much do I get paid to make me want to be approved? And that really is also about the growth cycle of this entire organization as well. I mean, if you think about it, you're getting into it in the early stages, so there's not going to be much there to sink your teeth into in terms of incentive. But as you develop with it, it's going to be very clear what the incentive is. And if you're a first mover, your longevity in the system weighs favorably towards you. So if you want to have some sort of game theoretic construct, it really is, it's about playing off the odds about this whole thing working and being the first one in the system.
Yeah, it's fascinating. It's almost like, I think, you hit the nail on the head earlier when you said that we have ecosystems of actors, and now I'm beginning to see how the risk teams would be a fairly robust ecosystem in itself, with incentivization and reputation and research.
I saw a quick question here from Nick. Are we imagining these as non-profit organizations? And David has answered correctly, no, not necessarily. Yeah, in fact, you've got to keep in mind that service provision is generally not done on a non-profit basis. You might find some will do it because it is a function of a larger thing that they're trying to do. Given that, it makes sense, but generally I would expect that folks want to do this to be appropriately incentivized and enriched.
Steven, there's there's a good question. When will risk governance switch from MakerDAO to more external teams? When do you envision the first risk teams, like outside risk teams, to be really begun to be implemented? Do you think it's like post-launch? Well, it would have to be like post-launch of multi-collateral DAI, but what do you see as like the trajectory of the decentralization of the risk function?
Well, decentralization will kind of work like this. We launch and we demonstrate how we manage to get collateral into the system. We demonstrate how we created a dialogue around it and stepped it all the way through to an executive vote. In other words, how we de-risk the contention in it. And on the basis of that, I don't think people out there suffer from not knowing what to do. From the tooling aspect, they just really want to have a sequence of events that they know they need to follow. And once we've demonstrated that, I would suspect that a couple of months after that, you'd have 2 or 3 folks, and 2 or 3 entities rather. And they would either be using some sort of derivation of what we have, or they'll be creating something from scratch. I see there's a follow-up question here that says, so there needs to be a clear standard operating procedure. Well, in essence, not a clear standard operating procedure, but you need to follow at least the governance route in terms of producing what you think is a worthy collateral type, getting the dialogue around it, and then obviously putting that proposal into the voting construct and having a governance poll on it. And then from there, once the contention is clearly out, we've de-risked it enough, it can then be placed into a proposal for an executive vote. So the standard operating procedure is more on how you go about delivering your submission than it is about how you actually go about doing the calculation, because that calculation is already vetted in the approval of the risk team into the system. Your tools, your mechanisms, your processes, and your thinking is effectively what's been challenged. And once that challenge has been put forward and satisfied and is approved, then ultimately you need to rely on the fact that whatever is produced from those processes will result in the appropriate numbers, given the data is good data. So that's the mechanism in short. I'm trying to keep it short without going into and revisiting older items.
Steven, really briefly, can you give the different components of the stability fee one more time? I'm just trying to take some notes.
So off the top of my head, let me think. I split the stability fee into the I'm drawing a blank here for a second. So there's a credit component, there's the operating component, and there's a third component that just, I don't know why it just slipped my head right now. It's not liquidity because we don't have liquidity. It's something fairly obvious. Why am I not thinking of it? It's basic interest rates components. I'll think of it and get back to you.
Sure, thanks.
Wow, it completely slipped my head right now. I mean, it literally was on my tongue 20 minutes ago.
Is it like the policy tool component, or like the
policy component is in the operating costs.
Operating. Okay.
I'll think about it. There was credit. Why can't I think of this right now? Okay, I'll get back to you on that. So as we sort of mentioned, we now understand, there's an ecosystem around this distributed risk team function, and we have a sense of how these teams will form and how these teams will submit, and how they'll be duly incentivized. But at the same time, what we haven't spoken about is the aggregation mechanism, because very much like oracles, you do have these submissions, and you've got to weight them appropriately in a form that not only gets a proper representation of what the risk function is recommending, but also protects against any submissions that clearly are trying to maneuver or manipulate the system. So that is also an open book right now. The weighting in terms of contribution is easy enough because, as we mentioned before, where the weighting comes from, but there has to be a sort of security element as well, where even though we do have a well-vetted risk team, they've done wonderful work, and they've contributed for the longest time, all of a sudden, one day, somehow they get manipulated and they try and use the influence to come in with a really odd set of numbers. That should be easily found out if you check against their process. And then after that, obviously being able to disqualify them as a risk team.
That's a great point. So you're saying
you still need that security sort of module in place to do this checking. So you might find that another component of the function is having risk teams that check other risk teams.
Yeah, that's where I was going. Is there a formalized mechanism for checks and balances in this model right now, or is it just
not as yet? Because the problem being is that you start with turtles and becomes turtles all the way down.
Yeah.
Or what you end up doing is you start centralizing compliance. To a certain extent, you've got to realize that this distributed function is that it's distributed, and you have to rely that with all these biased opinions, you'll get severely biased opinions, and hopefully it does get washed out of the works.
It's a great topic for a conversation or for continued discussion. So we've identified the risk teams. The risk teams create proposals. Those proposals get voted in, and they eventually get ratified as executive votes. But there's this very critical step that we don't talk about very often, which is the vetting process or the community input or the debate process about these votes. And I'm beginning to think that the risk teams forwarding a proposal is probably just the first or like a small step almost compared to the amount of feedback and interaction and debate that's going to be occurring as people attempt to pull these things apart. Or at least that's my hope. My hope is that we get some very healthy debate and people actually running the numbers to validate them before these things actually make it into a vote.
Yeah, the one aspect that I'm trying to still figure out is standardizing how one presents their tools so that it can be analyzed, it can be tested, but not on a level which you need a freaking PhD to understand what's happening. But at the same time, you have a good sense of what they're trying to achieve, and you can map the thinking to the output. I mean, that is essential. I mean, ultimately, this does boil down to a subjective interpretation. But the point being is, let's get that subjective interpretation under the foundation of scientific mechanism, and that allow us to at least, de-risk a lot of the issues.
Yeah, I'm trying to conceptualize what that would be like as well, whether as part of you're developing these procedures for the risk teams that they have to standardize on the Jupyter notebook or something, or that everybody needs to be able to run themselves, or here's the way that a model is recreated in our system. It's an interesting question.
So on that basis, we've got 9 minutes left, so I'm amazingly on time, this must be a first. But
I think Akiva has a question in the chat about sourcing the data used in the risk assessment.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. Basically, right now, there is the ability to use paid entry points, and then you collect your own data and keep it on your own database, and consequently derive models from it. But then you have to obviously show that data, and then you have to show where you got it from, and you might even have to show the cleaning mechanism. So it can be a process, or it can be simple. And what I'm doing is I'm trying to keep it as simple as possible. It's not the best mechanism. I do understand this, but everyone has access to CoinMarketCap. So because it's so ubiquitous, I will use that. And then everyone can test the model. It may not necessarily be the best data, but you can see a consistency in terms of where it's sourced and how it's used. The other thing to keep in mind, and this is something I have learned in the traditional space, is that, I mean, I've used Reuters, Bloomberg's, you name it. And even those guys don't get it 100% correct. I've had some circumstances where I've pulled down a history of Walmart from Bloomberg and Reuters, and lo and behold, there are certain line items that are just different.
Akiva raises another interesting point about bad data, and I think this is something we've discussed in earlier meetings, where we would have sort of, or potentially we could have approved data sets, or data sets from DEXs only, as opposed to, or an approved list of centralized exchanges where we're reasonably confident that there's no wash trading, and potentially there'd be weighting applied to those different data sets, or maybe even a common trade data set, exchange data set that people are expected to use. Something that's been approved might be interesting.
It's interesting. This is something I found in the traditional world as well, and that is, if you have an issue with the data, you start finding it becomes more centralized around folks who have taken the time and inclination to look after it. And by nature, it's kind of strange. You think you have this whole batch of traders affecting trades on their own information, where actually they're all affecting trades off the same information, which is really, it sort of goes against the whole concept of having these different biased point of views.
I think we might have reached the end of the questions, unless anybody else has anything else they want to jump in at the very end.
There's no more questions. I actually like to point out that Mike just put out the new version of MakerDAO tools.
Yeah, so it's actually that is a good point to raise, and I think that'll be something we'll be discussing in further meetings as well. Is that Maker Tools is a great resource, and Mike I've been having conversations with him about sort of morphing this thing into a risk team type asset, where we can start adding things that risk teams would be more interested in, so they can start making some informed decisions.
So, David, to answer your question about the stability fee, the part that I missed was the inflation rate, purchasing power. So it's inflation rates, operational cost, and credit insurance premium. Ultimately, on an interest rate, you also have a liquidity premium as well. But we've got a very unique setup, so that doesn't directly apply. So it's inflation, operational cost, credit insurance premium. And in operational cost, you've got the policy mechanism as well.
So the operational component has the policy, and the credit component is also the insurance component.
Yeah, so the credit is insurance. Yeah.
All right, I also have another question. So would Maker token holders be able to vote on a granular level what those components should be represented by, or will it be just represented by a single fee and everybody will kind of just understand that those are baked in?
MKR token holders can decide on making the whole thing an ice cream factory if they want. So whatever moves them to look at these parts, it really is up to them. It is really not for me to say, but I can stipulate quite honestly that that's like going down the worst kind of rabbit hole in the world. The reason being is we're talking about granular operational procedures all the way through to attributing costs to each of those procedures, and then understanding how they aggregate into creating the best way to create an efficient mechanism and then pay for it appropriately. So it is, if you want to quit your job and spend 24 hours a day and still not have enough time, then that's something that may be considered. It really does. It's got to get the majority's interest. And if you do have the majority's interest and you can split up that work over that majority, then I think it's possible.
Gotcha.
There's actually an infinite, there's a whole bunch of, when it comes to risk, when it comes to operating MakerDAO, we're just starting on the basic structures. It's almost like, Henry Ford's first car. It works, it goes, it's got simple mechanisms. It's not going to have all the creature features. But as we go along, we're going to be very clear about what those features are. We're going to all be able to concentrate on them a little bit more clearly. Okay, so from my point of view, just to recap, we did a whole bunch of things. We spoke about risk teams today, basically who can be a risk team and who should be a risk team. We discussed the ecosystem around the distributed risk team function, and basically how do we apply the sort of collection of risk contributions to the system. What are the objectives and the incentives? I think we covered at least an outline of that, but as you can see, this thing is always as deep as you want it to be. And if you have any questions, please feel free to email them to me. If you're on Rocket Chat, please feel free to send them to me, and I shall get around to them.
Before we end the meeting, I'm gonna post. So Rich in the beginning of the call mentioned that we have sound recordings of these calls. We have video recordings of these calls, and one of our awesome community members, Scott, actually does a written write-up of these calls. I think he usually does it on Friday, so it should be out in a couple of days. But I'm gonna post a link to that in the chat if you guys are interested in having that resource.
All right, thanks, David. Thank you, Steven. Thanks, everybody, for your excellent questions today. And I'm looking forward to seeing you all again next week.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Steven.
Take care, guys. Thank you, everybody.